Gold Ray Dam on the Rogue River was built in 1903-04 and for many years was the largest, most significant power generation facility in all of southern Oregon. It brought new industry to the valley, and it brought an excitement that's hard to imagine today. The video you're about to see is the story of the two brothers that thought up the idea, had the crazy notion that they could turn water into electricity in southern Oregon, how they built the Gold Ray Dam, how they operated the Gold Ray Dam, and ultimately how the Gold Ray Dam outlived its usefulness. In 2010, to improve fish passage on the Rogue River, the Gold Ray Dam was taken out, the powerhouse was dismantled, parts of it were salvaged, and most of it was taken away. The Gold Ray Dam stood on the Rogue River for 106 years. It doesn't anymore. This is the story of the Gold Ray Dam. Colonel Frank Ray lived in New York. He was a vice president of the American Tobacco Company. His brother, Charles Ray, also known as Dr. Ray, had been in Alaska where he was trying his hand at gold mining, apparently with not much success. As Charles was getting ready to leave Alaska, Frank communicated to him, "Why don't you go to Medford and check on my investments there?" Frank owned the Braden mine, which was a very profitable mine near Gold Hill. Charles went down to Medford, investigated, saw the possibilities, and apparently decided to stay here and manage his brother's investments. Over the course of time, Charles convinced Frank that operating the Braden mine with a steam-driven power system was not as efficient as doing so with electricity. And so Frank Ray, at Charles Ray's insistence, started buying up property on both sides of the Rogue River, looking for a place to build a hydroelectric facility. They decided that a site near Tola was the most appropriate site because of the bedrock there, and they began building a power facility with the intent of powering their mine. After they got it going, they realized that they could make more money selling electricity to the local communities than they could mining. So they sold the mine and kept the electric station. This is a photo from 1929. The center of everything out there was the powerhouse, and that was where all of the activity and most of the investment was focused. The project manager probably had his own home, may have lived there with his family, and this could well be his house. The other workers lived in what started out as a clubhouse, probably became a bunkhouse. There's talk in some early newspaper accounts about workers being housed at the site. There were, many workers working on this project for over a year. And then after it was completed, the Rays envisioned it as something like a clubhouse where people would come out and spend the day playing cards, smoking cigars, whatever guys did then. Up at the top of the hill is this elaborate structure that's the water tower. And all it was a tank. They pumped water up to it, held the tank, and then used water pressure to come down and serve the facility. Put a little Greek colonnade on it. It was a pretty elaborate little building for what it was. This is Dr. Charles Ray, proud of his new purchase. This is a 1904 original vertical turbine at Gold Ray in the original part of the powerhouse that was built to supply power to Medford for the first time. You can compare the vertical turbine with the horizontal turbines that actually powered Gold Ray after 1905. This is the plan drawing of the original Gold Ray powerhouse, probably drawn in 1904. It's narrow, it's got a very small cupola on it, and this is the design of the power system when there were two vertical turbines rather than the horizontal turbines that were installed later. We don't know exactly what the capacity of this project was. It was probably about 425 kilowatts. About half, a third of what Gold Ray would become. And they used this into late 1904 when they started generating power and sending it to Medford for the first time. And the demand was such that they immediately realized it was too small. So they began making plans to build a larger plant. In early 1905, they ordered two giant generators from the General Electric Corporation, 750 kilowatts each. They couldn't shut off the initial turbines because they still had to provide power to the city. So what they did was redesign the forebay and take what had previously been a straight shot from the headgates and expanded it into the river channel, widening it so that they could continue to send water to the original turbines while they excavated a pit for larger turbines and built an extension to the powerhouse. This is a very, very unusual design. They put in horizontal turbines, not vertical turbines like we think of usually. These turbines didn't spin like a top, they spun like a squirrel cage. And the water would come through and spin the turbines, which would spin a drive shaft. And where it gets very unusual, instead of the drive shaft being connected directly to the generator, which is what happens in most powerhouses, it was collected first to a lower pulley, and then that lower pulley, which was buried in the bowels of the powerhouse, was connected to an upper pulley by 1,600 feet of 1.5-inch manila rope. That upper pulley, which was up at the power floor level, would then spin another drive shaft, and that drive shaft would drive the 750 kilowatt generators. This drawing, updated to 1910, shows sort of how the powerhouse evolved. The two 750 kilowatt generators are in place. You can see the rope drive pulleys and how they're offset, and you can see the 4 turbine wheels that spun the whole thing. You can also see over here where the old wheel pits from the original 1904 turbines had been removed. And what I like about this one is that you can also see that the Ray brothers were thinking ahead, and that they put into their new extended forebay space for future draft tube openings for units 3 and 4. Those units never got built, but they were planning ahead when they made the forebay so wide. Even with the expanded capacity after 1905, 1.5 megawatts, there was still a need for more power. And so they brought back one of the original 1904 generators and reinstalled it into the powerhouse. Probably generated about 425 kilowatts, which would have given a total capacity to Gold Ray of just over 2 megawatts. In the second turbine bay, in the original powerhouse, they put in a centrifugal pump that was capable of pumping 2,000 gallons per minute. This was part of an irrigation scheme for irrigation in orchards. That didn't work out so well, and they eventually took it out. One of the really interesting things about this drawing, which is dated 1908, right after this generator had been put in, is that it too obviously was a rope drive system. The 1904 generator that was reinstalled in the powerhouse in 1908 stays in use at Gold Ray until 1921, and then Copco, who had by that time purchased this facility, moved it down to a power plant in Keno on the Klamath River. This drawing was done in 1906, and it shows you the newly expanded powerhouse with the 2 larger generation units in place. The 2 rope drive systems are visible, the twin 42-inch turbines are in place, and the discharge arches and everything from the original 1904 powerhouse have essentially been closed off and are abandoned. When the Gold Ray project was first developed in 1904, it was an industrial facility, but it was also sort of a tourist destination, and it was envisioned as the showplace of industry and of the future. They actually had tours out there. There was a train line that ran on the other side of the river channel, and it would stop, and people would get off. They would go and fish at Gold Ray. They would come and see the timber mill and visit the dam site and the powerhouse. There was this elaborate bridge across the channel so that you didn't have to walk. The Rays built a clubhouse, this very large 2-story building that was built up the slope from the powerhouse, and envisioned it as sort of being a man's place, I think, where people could come and have drinks and play cards and that sort of thing. They built a whole series of structures to support all of these industrial and sort of almost social uses on the site. And probably the best testament to that, in addition to the clubhouse, was the little water tank, which they took the trouble of putting a colonnade in front of and turning it into a little Grecian temple. By 1941, the Rays were long gone, and a large building, which had been built as a clubhouse, had outlived its usefulness. There just weren't that many people at Gold Ray anymore, and there certainly wasn't much of a social scene. The California-Oregon Power Company, being more businesslike, tore down that large building and built these 2 little bungalows on the same site, still using the fine stone wall and retaining all of those site improvements, but building buildings for probably the 1 or 2 workers that now operated the facility for them. And that rock wall still survives, along with all of the wonderful stonework and what must have been a fountain. They got tired of the fussiness of the water tower by 1941, and they took that colonnade off and just exposed the water tower, which looks like we would expect a water tower at an industrial facility to look. The powerhouse is built with heavy timbers, built to survive the shaking of the generators and the flooding of the river, and poured concrete walls go down to bedrock. The little box on the top of the roof is called a monitor. It allowed light to get into the interior, and it allowed, more importantly, heat to get out, and was a very common element in 19th and early 20th century industrial architecture, where a lot of heat and dust and smoke would be created. And just like a chimney, you need some way for it to get out, and the monitor was the way they did that. But it also creates really nice light on the inside and a more comfortable work environment. The Gold-Ray powerhouse produced 1.5 megawatts of power. When it was first built, that was so much power they didn't quite know how they were going to use it all. Within 10 years, of course, people discovered the convenience of electricity. Copco began building other power projects, one at Prospect and the largest down on the Klamath River, both of which were significantly larger than Gold-Ray. And they kept this one, but it really was too small to make much changes. And that's what makes it so interesting, in that essentially it's unaltered from the way it looked when it opened in 1904. It has all of its original equipment, the original twin 750 kilowatt generators, and the old switchgear is all still there. And so it's really sort of a piece of time, standing on the Rogue River, just as it did when Colonel Ray and Dr. Ray opened it up in 1904. These are the generators themselves, massive pieces of equipment for their time, probably got taken to the site on train and then trucked across the bridge with horse-drawn equipment. This thing that looks like a small motor is actually the exciter. It's sort of a starter motor. A small amount of water would get it started. It would produce 11 kilowatts of electricity, which was enough to kickstart the large 750 kilowatt generator. And then they didn't have to put a huge drain on the turbine immediately by kickstarting that large piece of equipment. This is the back of the switchboard. Kind of gives you an idea of state-of-the-art electric generation, 1904. The switchboard itself is all backed in marble. Marble doesn't conduct electricity, and so it was considered a safe material. And they would control the operation of these generation units. Again, the interesting thing about this is that they really never upgraded it or changed it much. 1.5 megawatts is such a small amount of power, and even was a small amount of power by 1920, that this plant wasn't worth upgrading. Copco, at various times, all through the 1930s and up until the 1970s, looked at taking the old 1904 turbines out and putting in new units. And every time they did it, they decided that it wasn't economical to do so. And so the Gold-Ray powerhouse just kind of sat there with no modification. It was producing power up until the early 1970s. There you can see, nothing much has changed since 1904. This thing here is a centrifugal pump that was connected to the generation units and created the domestic water supply at the Gold-Ray project site. The motor would turn those serial pumps and send water up a pipe, up the hill to the storage tank at the top. This odd piece of equipment sat next to the water pump on the powerhouse floor. I spent a certain amount of time trying to figure out its function and never was able to decide what exactly it did, so its purpose is lost to the ages. This is what I guess would be called the pulley room. These are the two upper pulleys, both covered with metal protective covers so that if a rope broke, you weren't hit with 1,600 feet of rope. This is a shaft connected to the wicket gates, which controlled the flow of water to the turbines themselves. You're now looking down into below the power floor, into the interior of the powerhouse where the lower pulleys are. Here's Unit 2's upper pulley. You can see those grooves where the rope would go. This is the stairwell down to the lower pulley area. When the plant was operational, of course, this wouldn't have been filled with water, and you would have gone down there to lubricate the lower pulleys or maintain them. They had to rebraid the rope when it broke, and it was quite an art to resplice the rope. The last operator of the plant said working at Goldray was a little bit like being a sailor. Like all early industrial facilities, the powerhouse took advantage of natural light and natural ventilation, and so it has perimeter windows around much of it and a nice monitor roof that used to have openable transom windows so that the heat that would be generated by all of this equipment could have a place to escape. Although they were powered by electricity, manpower was still pretty important, and here's a simple little winch that we don't know exactly how it was used. The rope drive, the ropes are about 1.5 inches in diameter. There would be 20 of them in series, and they would spin as a unit, much like the fan belt on your car. Here you can see the ropes through a protective screen. You definitely wouldn't want to get your finger caught in there. In the scale of electrical generation, Goldray was a pretty small plant. But when it was built, it was the state of electrical technology in 1904. This was going to create more power than had ever been created in the Rogue Valley. More power than they knew that they would ever be able to use. And it's a testament, I suppose, to the success of the electrification of the Rogue Valley that within a decade this plant had been so overwhelmed by the demands upon it that they had to build plants that were 10 times larger up at Prospect and down on the Klamath. But until Goldray started producing power, Southern Oregonians didn't really realize how convenient it was going to be to have it. This is the forebay, where the water would come off the main channel of the river, go through a head gate, and these are the head gates at the head of the forebay. These metal screens are called trash racks, and they're exactly what you think they are. They keep trash, usually logs, from coming into the forebay and getting stuck in the turbines, which of course would be a big problem. This is the extension of the forebay. When they modified the Goldray powerhouse in 1905 to accommodate the larger turbines, they had to widen the forebay. These are the 1905 turbines, 42 inches in diameter. There are actually 4 of them, 2 to a unit. The wicket gates control the flow of water into the turbine. Here are the turbines being installed. The bar across the top of the turbines is the wicket gate control, and what it does is it opens and closes the water flow to the turbines. Those concrete casks are counterweights so that an operator doesn't have to fight the entire force of the Rogue River when he's trying to open and close water flow into the turbines. One of the interesting things about Goldray is because it was so old and because some of the documentation didn't come until late into the process, we didn't realize that there were actually 4 turbines underneath. When we started to excavate and remove the silt that accumulated in the last 40 years, we exposed the first turbine. And we also exposed the weights for the wicket gate control. and they kept going off into space, and nobody really knew why they kept going out that way until we realized that there was actually another turbine connected, and that there were 4 turbines, not 2. By 2010, Gold Ray was really a dream of another time. It had started out in 1904 as an exciting new world, the promise of electricity, the promise of industrialization and growth in the valley, and people were glad to see it built and excited to see it operate. Gold Ray was completed in 1904, and it did its job. It brought the valley into the modern era, it brought electricity to the bulk of the valley, it brought industry, and it brought excitement. It was bypassed by other larger hydroelectric facilities within 10 years of its construction, and for the last 80, 90 years it sat on the road and was sort of a relic of the past. It's too bad that Gold Ray had to go completely, but time marches on, and we learned a lot about Gold Ray by taking it down, probably more than we ever would have known had it just continued to stand there. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and I hope the next time you drive through Gold Hill along the Rogue River, you'll look at that wide spot filled with granite and remember what used to be there.